Let's go to our next guest now. Richard Powerside is a former Labour advisor and joins us. Very good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you for joining us.
Former Labour official, I should say.
Sorry?
Former Labour official rather than advisor.
I mean, does that... OK, fair enough. All right, then, big difference.
I wouldn't want to suggest that I was taking on somebody else's job. That's
OK, very, very fair enough. Two topics I want to talk to you about in particular today. Obviously, first up, Keir Starmer's address to the nation today. He says basically, he was aware of, Axel Ruda had been, the Southport killer had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions. He was aware of these terror links. He later, with questioned, was admitted, yes, this was an act of terror where these 3 little girls and 8 others were stabbed. 3 little girls died. But he said there hasn't been a cover-up. He also said that people were right to be angry. Why did he think last summer, do you think, that people who were angry were all far right?
That's not what he said. Last summer, he said that he talked about far-right thuggery. Yeah, so he was talking about people who were violent being far-right. And that seems like a very reasonable thing to me. I want to pick you up on this thing about him saying yesterday that it was an act of terrorism, because that's become a big part of the debate, one of the things that Nigel Farage has picked up on. Look, he's made the decision as a leader to describe that as an act of terrorism. He has every right to do that. But the police have still not actually classed it as terrorism, as far as I'm aware. And they've done that on the basis of the evidence they've got. I mean, some people are saying that they think this terrible, terrible crime was like the act of a really mad, ill person as opposed to the act of a terrorist. Now, you can make a philosophical question or whatever about what the difference between those things is. But the point is the police have never at any point said that they're sure it was a terror event.
Except that he possessed ricin, and had made ricin, but also he possessed an Al-Qaeda terrorist manual. Now, the key thing about that is he's admitted guilt of owning that manual, downloading it. The act of doing that is a terror offence.
So I'm not disagreeing with you about whether or not we think he's a terrorist, or whether or not I personally think.
I mean, I wonder if this matters to those 3 little girls' mums. Does this matter?
Well, that's completely different. Okay, but you're talking about 2 different things here, right? And these are really important differences, because the accusation of a cover-up is predicated on the idea that somebody should have, that the government should have said when these terrible murders happened that a terrorist act had taken place. And the point is that the police at no point have said that they thought that they had evidence that the murders were a terrorist event. Not that he was.
Except they did have evidence, because they found ricin in a terrorist manual, which they didn't mention for 3 months and only charged with him much later on.
And the police have to be incredibly careful about what information they release.
You are allowed to say you've charged someone with these offences. What's interesting is when you haven't charged them with those offences, when most people would have expected those would have been part of the charges.
It's incredibly important that we don't mix up very, very different things here, right? You're asking me to talk about Keir Starmer and what the government's chosen to do, and now you're talking about the police and what the police
you're talking about the police. You're saying the police. I'm asking you about Keir Starmer. I'm asking about the political decision of what.
Me about Keir Starmer.
Yes, and you talked about the police. Richard, I'm not sure we're getting very...
Because we talked about the definition of a terror offence and what Starmer had said about that. And I'm trying to talk about the ridiculous accusations that have been made and show how they don't have a factual basis. And the way that people manage to make these conspiracy theories seem like they're sticking is by mixing up very different things.
OK. One of the things he said was this case needs to be a line in the sand, and that the failures to prevent this murder and this man's actions leaps off the page. And he says the government will, in the inquiry, ask and answer difficult questions unburdened by cultural and institutional sensitivities. Why would there be a public inquiry into the Southport attack, but not a public inquiry into the grooming gangs, when only a few weeks ago Keir Starmer was talking about how those who were talking about the issues regarding largely Pakistani British men perpetrating grooming gangs against white working class women in up to 50 cities around the country, how they were also far right. Now, the very words that had meant that there weren't investigations, that people didn't come forward, and that these men were able to continue their mass rape and abuse of these girls for so long because of these so-called cultural and institutional sensitivities. He's a bit of a hypocrite, isn't he?
So what, as in you're asking, why is there a national inquiry into one and not into the other?
I'm asking, he's a hypocrite, isn't he?
No, there's an inquiry into one because there's a national institution that, or national institutions that may have failed, for instance, the Prevent programme, that needs to have a national inquiry into it. The Alexis J inquiry into sexual predation against children has already looked at the national elements of the grooming gang.
No, it hasn't. No, it didn't.
And the
didn't.
local councils where failures appear definitely to have been made with regards to grooming are where there is an appropriate place to have those inquiries, because that's where we think the failures have been made.
OK, well, I mean, again, a lot of people would argue that's simply not the case. And as Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, made the point, it's about joining the dots, that this is something that happened, you know, across so many towns and cities for so long.
Kemi Badenoch, who was in government for several years.
Abject failings by the last Tory government.
Isn't it? She's suddenly leader of the opposition. Oh, suddenly she cares about these things. Come on.
She had, I mean, she made a point in PMQs that she had actually spoken about this. But I agree with you. Abject failings by the Tory government over many of these years. I've made that very clear on air repeatedly.
We think that governments led by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were scared of doing something that might offend cultural sensitivities. It's just stupid. It's embarrassing. It's nonsense made up by a bunch of people who are flailing around for things to say on Twitter. That's what the Tory party is these days.
OK. A lot of people will probably agree with you on a lot of that. Do you think, though, from what you know, that there has been a failure by organisations to actually deal with the issue of Axel Rudickabana? And do you think that actually a lot of the concerns that people were raising back in, you know, late July and early August last summer were legitimate concerns, given what we know now?
There's just so many different things in your question there. Like, so have there been failings? Well, obviously there have been failings. 3 children were murdered. Were things that people said in July legitimate? And people said a lot of different things in July. But if we're asking, like, is violence more likely to be committed by people from migrant backgrounds? No, it's not. And, like, is migration a wonderful thing for our country that's been happening for an incredibly long time and makes us more diverse and more strong? Yes, it is.
By the way, is violence more likely to be committed by migrants from certain backgrounds and certain regions? Absolutely it is, in terms of criminality from people from certain regions and certain countries. Statistically, this is absolutely clear.
Not true. When you adjust for class, that's not true. We know the crime is very closely related to socioeconomic status, which isn't very surprising. People who are screwed over by our economy are much more likely to experience trauma, to do terrible things. It's not very surprising, is it? We have an incredibly unfair society, and people who suffer end up imposing suffering on other people.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to disagree on some of that. I want to get to one final point, though. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, otherwise known as Rachel from Accounts, is travelling to Davos today, to the World Economic Forum. When she was in opposition, being much feted, she was asked to give keynote speeches, appearing on panels. This week, not been invited to do a single speech, not appearing on a single stage on a panel. Clearly, no one seems to want to know what she thinks about anything when it comes to the British economy. We've seen unemployment up to 4.4%. She's desperately trying to get some investment and growth for the UK, and we've seen very low growth levels. We're virtually stagnant right now, as some other economies, like America, look like they're about to really take off. Has Rachel Reeves been sort of, I suppose, exposed as a failing Chancellor?
I think you've been slightly misinformed there, Julia, because actually Rachel Reeves was invited to make a speech, and she decided not to.
Why would she decide not to make a speech?
Because at Davos, that's not, frankly, the most important or useful thing to do. Like what she's been really focused on is not doing these like huge set piece, here I am
Yes.
events. She's been doing things which are actually useful to the British economy, like going and talking to the important people around the world who might bring a bit of cash into the UK economy. I think that's a great thing to be
I
doing.
mean, she did a great job in China, didn't she? Multi-billion-pound economy, and she got a whole £600 million of investment. I mean, whoopity-doo-dah.
These events are not about having a headline where you can
Oh,
say, "Oh, look, how much money I got in like
aren't they?
a kind of 1 day visit." It's about building up relationships, and it's incredibly difficult right now for us to make sure that we, on the one hand, are creating those firewalls between the UK economy and the Chinese economy that keep us safe and secure. And on the other hand, we don't just immediately upend all of our trade relationships. That's
Okay.
something that requires the highest level political relationships to be maintained, but being maintained in a
All right.
careful way. That's what Reeves was doing in Beijing.
Richard Parasite, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us, former Labour official Richard there.